Okay, I know it's morning and not night for most of you, um, but I'm night walking schedule right now. To me, this is bedtime. So I'm going to read from The Plague by Albert Camus. We're pretty far along in this book. We're in section 4. I don't know if we'll finish today. It might be one more reading after this, and then we'll be done with this book. And when that happens, I'm going to have some alternatives for you, and I want to go over them really quick. I'm going to have a poll later on today to see what you guys want me to read next, if you want me to read next. I've got some short stories this time. The Poor by Steve Rasmussen, which is a good horror story, short horror story. I've got from Machineries of Joy by Bradbury, Almost the End of the World, which is a really good one. I've got some Shirley Jackson, An Ordinary Day with Peanuts, which is also a really good short story. A little longer, but still really good. And then, of course, There Will Come Soft Rains, which is one of my favorite Bradbury stories ever written. It's also very short. And then, if you want another long book after The Plague, I thought I would offer up Slapstick, which is actually not a very long novel. It's about half as long as The Plague, but kind of like The Plague, it feels pertinent. It feels like it fits the times. So we've got some options. I'll list them in a poll later on today here on Instagram. We'll see what everybody wants me to read next. I've got 2 cameras set up because Instagram Live isn't saving anything for me, so I can't put it on YouTube. So it's a whole tech thing. But anyway, so we'll pick up with part 4 of The Plague. We've gotten to the point where they have a serum treatment, and the first test was on a child who died regardless of the serum. Actually, he suffered longer than most because it just kept him alive a little bit longer, even though he was still very sick. So, I'm going to pick up there, part 4. Since joining Ryu's band of workers, Father Panelu had spent his entire time in hospitals and places where he came in contact constantly with the plague. He had elected for this place among his fellow workers that he judged incumbent on him, the forefront of the fight. And constantly, since then, he had rubbed shoulders with death. Theoretically immunized by periodical inoculations, he was well aware that at any moment death might claim him anyway, and he had given much thought to this. Outwardly, he had lost nothing of his serenity, but from the day on which he saw the child die, something seemed to change in him, and his face bore traces of the rising tension of his thoughts. When one day he told Dr. Ryu with a smile that he was working on a short essay entitled, "Is a Priest Justified Consulting with the Doctor?" Dr. Ryu had gathered that something graver lay behind the question than the priest's tone seemed to imply. On the doctor's saying he would greatly like to have a look at the essay, Panelu informed him that he would shortly be preaching at a mass, and his sermon would convey some at least of his considered opinions on the question. "I do hope you come, Doctor. The subject will interest you." A high wind was blowing on the day Father Panelu preached his second sermon of the Plague era. The congregation, it must be admitted, was sparse, much more sparse than the first sermon, partly because this kind of performance had lost its novelty for the townfolk. Considering the abnormal conditions they were up against, the very word novelty had lost all meaning. And most people, assuming they had not altogether abandoned religious observances, or did not combine them naively with an immoral way of living, had replaced religious practice by more or less extravagant superstitions. Thus, they were readier to wear prophylactic medals of St. Roch than to go to Mass. An illustration may be found in the remarkable interest shown in prophecies of all descriptions. In the spring, when the epidemic was expected to end abruptly at any moment like a miracle, no one troubled to take another's opinion as to its probable duration, since everyone had persuaded themselves that it would have no duration. As the days went by, fear grew up that the calamity might last indefinitely, and then the end of the plague became the target of all hope. As a result, copies of predictions attributed to soothsayers, psychics, or saints of the Catholic Church circulated freely from hand to hand. The local printing firms were quick to realize the profit to be made by pandering to this new craze, and they printed large numbers of these false prophecies that had been going round in a manuscript. Finding that the public appetite for this sort of literature was still unsated, they researched municipal libraries for all the mental pabulum of the kind available in old chronicles, memoirs, and the like. And when this source too ran dry, they commissioned journalists to write up forecasts, opinions, and in this respect at least, the journalists proved themselves equal to their prototypes of earlier ages. Some of these prophetic writings were actually serialized in the newspaper and read with as much avidity as the love stories that had occupied these columns in the piping times of health. Some predictions were based on far-fetched arithmetical calculations involving the figures of the year, the total of deaths, other illnesses compared to the plague, and the number of months the plague had so far lasted. Others made comparisons with great pestilences of former times, drew parallels, which the forecasters called constants, and claimed to have deducted conclusions bearing on the present calamity. But the most popular prophets were undoubtedly those who, in apocalyptic jargon, had announced sequences of events, any one of which might be construed as applicable to the present state of affairs, and was obscure enough to admit of almost any interpretation. And so, Nostradamus and Saint Odelia were consulted daily, always with happy results. Indeed, the one thing these prophecies had in common was that ultimately all were reassuring. Unfortunately, though, the plague was not, and did not cease. And so superstition had usurped the place of religion in the life of the town, and that is why the church in which Panelu preached his sermon was only 3/4 full. That evening, when Ryu arrived, the wind was pouring in great gusts through the doors and filling the aisles with sudden draughts. And it was a cold, silent church, surrounded by a congregation of men exclusively, that Ryu watched the father climb onto the pulpit. He spoke in a gentle and more thoughtful tone than on previous occasions, and several times was noticed to be stumbling over his words. A more noteworthy change was that instead of saying "you," he now said "we." However, his voice gradually grew firmer as he proceeded. He started by recalling that for many a long month the plague had been in our midst, and we now knew it better after having seen it often seated at our tables or at the bedside of those we loved. We had seen it walking at our side, waiting for us at the places where we worked. And so now, perhaps, better able to understand what it was telling us, a message to which, in the first shock of the visitation, we might not have listened with due heed. What he, Father Panelu, had said in his first sermon was still true. Such, anyhow, was his belief. And yet, perhaps, as may befall any one of us, and here he struck his breast, his words and thoughts had lacked in charity. However this might be, one thing was not to be gainsaid, a fact that always, under all circumstances, we should bear in mind. Appearances notwithstanding, all trials, however cruel, worked for the good, for Christians. And indeed, when a Christian should always seek in his hour of trial was to discern that good in what it consisted and how best he could turn it to account. At this stage, the people near Ryu seemed to settle in against the armrests of their pews and make themselves comfortable. One of the big padded entrance doors was softly thudding in the wind, and someone got up to secure it. As a result, Dr. Ryu's attention wandered, and he did not follow well what Panelu went on to say. But it came to this. We might try to explain the plague, but above all, we should learn what it has to teach us. Ryu gathered that, to the father's thinking, there was nothing to be explained. His interest was aroused again when, in a more emphatic tone, the preacher said that there were some things we could grasp as touching God and others we could not. There was no doubt as to the existence of good and evil, and as a rule, it was easy to see the difference between them. The difficulty began when we looked into the nature of evil, and among things evil, Father Panelu now included human suffering. So, we had apparently needful pain and apparently needless pain. We had Don Juan cast into hell, and then we had a child's death. For while it is right that a libertine should be struck down, we see no reason for a child to suffer. And truth to tell, nothing was more important on earth than a child's suffering, the horror it inspires in us, and the reasons we must find to account for it. In all other manifestations of life, God made things easy for us, and so far, our religion had no merit. But in this respect, so to speak, we had our backs to the wall. Indeed, we all were up against the wall that the plague had built, all around us, and in its shadow we must work out our own salvations. Father Panelu refused to have recourse to simple devices enabling him to scale this wall. So, he might easily have assured them that the child's suffering would be compensated for by an eternity of bliss awaiting him. But how could he assure that when, to tell the truth, he knew nothing about it? For who would dare to assert that eternal happiness can compensate for a single moment of human suffering? He who said so must not be a true Christian, a follower of the Master who knew all the pangs of suffering in his body and soul. No, Father Panelu would keep faith with that great symbol of suffering, the tortured body on the cross. He would stand with his back to the wall and honestly face the terrible problem of this child's agony. And he would boldly say to those who listened to his words, "My brothers, a time of testing has come for us all. We must believe everything or deny everything. And who among you, I ask, would dare to deny everything?" It crossed Dr. Ryu's mind that Father Panelu was dallying with heresy in speaking this way, but he didn't have time to follow up the thought, as the preacher was declaring vehemently that this uncompromising duty laid on the Christian was his virtue and privilege. He was well aware that certain minds, schooled to an indulgent and conventional morality, might be dismayed or outraged by the excessive standard of Christian virtue about which he was speaking. But religion in a time of plague could not be the same religion as every day. While God might accept and even desire that the soul should take its ease and rejoice in happier times, in periods of extreme calamity, God laid extreme demands on us. And today, God had vouchsafed his creatures in an ordeal, so they must acquire and practice the greatest of all virtues, that of all or nothing. Many centuries previously, a profane writer had claimed to reveal a secret of the Church by declaring that purgatory did not exist. He wished to convey that there could be no half measures, only the alternative between heaven and hell. You were either saved or you were damned. That, said Father Panelu, was a heresy that could spring only from a blind soul. Nevertheless, there have been periods of history when purgatory could not be hoped for, periods when it is impossible to speak of venial sin, times when every sin is deadly and any indifference is criminal. It was all or it was nothing. The preacher paused, and Dr. Ryu heard more clearly the whistling of the wind outside. Father Panelu began again. He said the total acceptance of which he had been speaking was not to be taken in the limited sense usually given to his words. He was not thinking of resignation or humility. This involved humiliation, but a humiliation to which the person humiliated would give full assent. The agony of a child was humiliating to the heart and mind, and that was why we had to come to terms with it. And that was why, and here Panelu assured those present that it was not easy to say what he was about to say, that since it was God's will, we too should will it. In this way only, the Christian could face the problem squarely and pierce to the heart of the supreme issue, the essential choice. and the choice would be to believe everything, so as not to be forced into denying everything. Like those worthy women who, after learning that buboes were the natural issues through which the body cast out infection, went to church and prayed, "Please God, give him buboes." Thus, a Christian should yield himself wholly to a divine will, even though it passed understanding. We must go straight to the heart of things that are unacceptable, precisely because it is thus that we are constrained to make our choice. The sufferings of children were the bread of affliction, and without this bread our souls would die of spiritual hunger. The shuffling sounds which usually followed the moment when the preacher paused were beginning to make themselves heard when he raised his voice, making as if to put himself in his hearer's place, and ask what then was the proper course to follow. He made no doubt that the ugly word fatalism would be applied to what he was saying. He would not boggle at this word, provided he were allowed to qualify it with the adjective active fatalism. Needless to say, there was no question of imitating the Abyssinian Christians of whom he had spoken previously, nor should we think of acting like those Persians, who in the time of plague threw their infected garments on the Christian sanitary workers and called on heaven to give the plague to infidels. On the other hand, it would be no less wrong to imitate the monks at Cairo, who, when plague was raging in the town, distributed the host with pincers at the Mass so as to avoid contact with wet mouths, in which infection might be latent. The Persians and the monks were equally at fault. For the former, the child's agony did not count, but for the latter, the dread of suffering ranked highest in their content. In both cases, the real problem had been shirked. Their ears were closed to the voice of God. Father Paneloux continued. There were other precedents of which he would now remind them. The Black Death at Marseille. Only 4 of the 81 monks in the Mercy Monastery survived this epidemic, and of those 4, 3 took to flight. When he read that chronicle, Father Paneloux had found his thoughts fixed on the monk who had stayed on by himself despite the death of his 77 companions and the example of his 3 brothers who had fled. And bringing down his fist on the edge of the pulpit, Father Paneloux cried in a ringing voice, "My brothers, each one of us must be the one that stays." There was no question of not taking precautions or failing to comply with the orders wisely promulgated for the public's health and safety in the disorder of a pestilence. We should not listen to moralists who told us to sink on our knees and give up. No, we should go forward, groping our way through the darkness, stumbling at times, and try to do what little good lay in our power. For the rest, we must hold fast, even in the death of little children, and seek no personal respite. At this point, Father Paneloux evoked the august figure of Bishop Belzunce during the Marseille plague. He reminded his hearers how, towards the close of that epidemic, the bishop, having done all that behooved him, shut himself up in his palace behind high walls and laid in a stock of food and drink. With a sudden revulsion of feeling, as in all times of extreme tribulation, the inhabitants of Marseille, who had idolized this man, now turned against him, piled up corpses around his house in order to infect it, and flung bodies over the walls to make sure of his death. And in a moment of weakness, the bishop himself had proposed to be isolated from the outside world. And lo and behold, corpses rained down on his head. There was a lesson here. We must convince ourselves there is no island of escape in the time of plague. There is no middle course. We must accept the dilemma and choose to either hate God or love God. And who dares choose to hate him? The preacher's tone showed he was nearing the end of his sermon. He said, "The love of God is a hard love. It demands total self-surrender, disdain of our human personality. And it alone can reconcile us to the suffering and death of children. It alone can justify this. We cannot understand it. This is the hard lesson I would share with you today. That is the faith, cruel in men's eyes and crucial in God's. We must aspire beyond ourselves toward that high and fearful vision, and on that lofty plane all will fall into place. Discord be resolved, and truth flash forth from the dark cloud of seeming injustice. So in some churches of the south of France, plague victims have lain sleeping, many centuries under the flagstones, and the priests now speak above their tombs, and the message they bring to men rises from the charnel house, to which, nevertheless, even children will contribute their share. As Dr. Ryu was preparing to leave the church after this sermon, a violent gust swept up through the half-opened doors and blew in the faces of the departing congregation. It brought with it a smell of rain, warning them of the weather they would encounter outside. An old priest and a young deacon were walking immediately in front of Ryu and had much difficulty keeping their headdresses from blowing away. But this did not prevent them from discussing the sermon they had heard. The elder paid tribute to the preacher's eloquence, but the boldness of thought Panelu had shown gave him pause. In his opinion, the sermon had displayed more uneasiness than real power, and at Father Panelu's age, a priest had no business feeling uneasy. The young deacon, his head bowed, replied that he saw much of the father, had followed the evolution of his views, and believed the forthcoming pamphlet would be bolder still. It might even be refused to be printed. "What's the main idea?" asked the old priest. They were now all in the cathedral square. The younger priest said to his companion that it's illogical for a priest to call in a doctor. Teru, when told by Dr. Ryu what Father Panelu had said, remarked that he had known a priest who had lost his faith during the war, as the result of seeing a young man's face with both eyes destroyed. "Father Panelu is right," Teru continued. "When an innocent youth can have his eyes destroyed, a Christian either loses his faith or consents to having his eyes destroyed. Panelu decides not to lose his faith, and he will go through with it to the end. That's what he means to say." It may be that this remark of Teru's throws some light on the regrettable events which followed, in the course of which the priest's conduct seemed inexplicable to his friends. The reader will judge for himself. How far are we? Okay. A few days after the sermon, Father Panelu had to move out of his rooms. It was a time when many people were obliged to change their residence owing to the new conditions created by the plague, and so Teru, when his hotel was closed, had to go live with Dr. Ryu. And now the father himself had to vacate the lodgings provided by the order and stay in the house of a pious old lady who so far had survived the epidemic. During the process of moving, Father Panelu had been feeling more run down than ever, mentally as well as physically. And it was this that put him in the bad books of his hostess. One evening, when she was enthusiastically vaunting the merits of Saint Odelia's prophecies, the priest betrayed impatience, probably due to fatigue. All his subsequent efforts to bring the good lady round to a state of benevolent neutrality came to nothing. He had made a bad impression, and it went on. Each night on his way to his bedroom, where almost all the furniture was dotted with crochet covers, he had to contemplate the back of his hostess seated in her drawing room, and carry away with him a memory of the sour "Good night, Father" she flung at him over her shoulder. It was on one such evening that he felt like a flood bursting the dikes, the onrush in his wrists and temples of the fever that had been latent in his blood for several days. The only available account of what followed comes from the lips of the old lady. Next morning she rose early, as was her wont. After a few hours, puzzled at not seeing the father leave his room, she brought herself with hesitation to knock at his door, and found him in bed after a sleepless night. He was having difficulty breathing and looked more flushed than usual. She suggested most politely that a doctor be called, but her suggestion was brushed aside, that in a manner that she described as very impolite, so she had no alternative but to leave the room. Later in the morning, the father rang and asked if he could see her. He apologized for his lack of courtesy and assured her that what he was suffering could not be plague, as he had none of the symptoms. It was just a passing indisposition. The lady replied with dignity that her suggestion had not been prompted by apprehension of that sort, but that she felt measure of responsibility for Father Panelu's welfare while he was under her roof. Did not reply, and his hostess, wishing to do her duty by him, offered to send him to the doctor. Father Panelu told her not to trouble, and added some explanations that seemed to her incoherent, a bit nonsensical. The only thing she gathered, and it was precisely this that appeared to her incomprehensible, was that the father refused to hear of a doctor's visit because it was against his principles. Her impression was that her guest's mind was unhinged by fever, so she confined herself to bringing him a cup of tea. Mindful of the obligations imposed on her by the situation, she visited him regularly every 2 hours. What struck her most was his restlessness, which continued throughout the day. He would throw off his blankets, pull them back, and run his hand over his forehead, glistening with sweat. Every now and then he would sit up in bed and try to clear his throat with a grating cough, which sounded like retching. At this time he seemed vainly to be struggling to force his lungs a clot of some substance that was choking him, and after each effort he would sink back exhausted on his pillow. Even now the old lady was reluctant to annoy her guest by calling in the doctor. After all, it might be nothing more than an attack of fever or seasonal flu, even though it seemed spectacular. However, in the afternoon she made another attempt to talk to the priest, but she could get out of him no more than a few phrases. She renewed her proposal to call in the doctor, and Panaloo sat up and in a stifled voice emphatically declined. Under these circumstances it seemed best to wait until the following morning. If Father Panaloo's condition showed no more improvement, she would call the number announced daily by the radio. Still conscious of her obligation, she resolved to visit him from time to time throughout the night and give him any attention he might need. After bringing him a decoction of herbal tea, she decided to lie down for a while, and waking at daybreak, she hurried to his room. Father Panaloo was lying quite still. His face had lost its deep flush of the previous day, and now had a deathly pallor, all the more impressive because the cheeks had kept their fullness. He was gazing at the bead fringe of the lamp hanging above the bed. When she entered, he turned his head to her, and, as she said, he looked as if he had been severely thrashed all night long and was more dead than alive. She was struck by the apathy of his voice when, on asking how he was feeling, he replied that he was in a bad way, did not need a doctor, but wished to be taken to the hospital to comply with the regulations. Panic-stricken, she hurried to the telephone. Dr. Ryu arrived at noon, and after hearing what the old lady had to say, he replied briefly that Panaloo was right, but it was probably too late. The father welcomed him with an air of complete indifference. As Dr. Ryu examined him, he was surprised to find none of the symptoms of bubonic plague, except the pneumonic symptoms, congestion, and obstruction of the lungs. But his pulse was so weak, and his general state so alarming, that there was no hope of saving him. "You have none of the specific symptoms of the disease," Ryu told him. "But I admit I can't be sure, and I must isolate you." The father smiled, as if for politeness' sake, and said nothing. Ryu left the room to make a telephone call and then came back. "I'll stay with you," he said gently. Father Panaloo showed more animation, and warmth came to his eyes when he looked at the doctor. Then, speaking quietly, and with such difficulty that it was impossible to tell if he was sad, he said, "Thank you, but priests can have no friends. We have given our all to God." He asked for the crucifix above the head of the bed, and when given it, turned away to gaze at it. At the hospital, Father Panaloo did not utter a word. He submitted passively to all treatment given him. However, his case continued doubtful, and Ryu could not feel sure how to diagnose it. For several weeks, indeed, the disease had seemed to make a point of confounding diagnoses. In the case of Father Panaloo, what followed was to show that this uncertainty had no consequence. His temperature rose, and through the day the cough grew louder, racking his feeble body. And at last, at nightfall, Father Panaloo brought up a clot of matter that was choking him. It was bright red. Even at the height of his fever, Panaloo's eyes kept their serenity, and when the next morning he was found dead, they betrayed nothing. Next to his name, in the plague cards, the index card recorded, "Doubtful case." We are one reading away from the end of this book. I'm going to save this. I'll put it on my live. I have the other camera set up, so it'll be on YouTube no matter what. In the next few minutes, it'll be up. Continuation. Again, we're really close to being done. One more reading, nice long one, finish the book, and then I've got all this stack here of new things, and I will put up a poll later today on Instagram, maybe on Facebook. I don't know if I can do one on Facebook, but I'll do it on Instagram at least, and I'll list the stories and a book or two that I would like to read you guys next. I have no idea how long we're all going to be locked in for, how long this is going to go on. When I started reading this, under the assumption that we had about probably 6 weeks, maybe, of quarantine, isolation, whatever you want to call it. Because of recent events, I have a feeling